Good to see you this morning. I'm sure everyone's having a good Mother's Day, and of course we have a lot of visitors and a lot of people that have come home for that. So it's good to see all of you. Obviously, very thankful for our mothers, and very thankful for a lot of the women in this room that I consider to be my mothers in the Lord. That some have taught me from a very young age about the gospel and about our Lord Jesus. Obviously, knowing that we were going to have probably a full crowd today and have a lot of visitors, I could not help but take this opportunity to tell you about Jesus. And being that I had an idea that we would have, probably a lot of visitors here and that sort of thing, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk about how badly we need Jesus. In Hebrews 13, if you want to start turning there, a 13-chapter book between Philemon and James, is expressing that very well about how badly we all need Jesus. In Hebrews 13, throughout the book so far, the Hebrews writer has been putting Jesus in a high place. In chapter 1, he says that Jesus was there at creation. Chapter 2, it says that Jesus is higher than the angels. In chapter 7, it says that Jesus is in the sanctuary making mediation between us and God. In chapter 12, Jesus is at the right hand of God. And then in chapter 13, instead of putting him in a high place, he leaves Jesus in a lowly place. He says that Jesus is outside the camp. Let's read this passage, and we'll spend the rest of my time with you talking about what this passage means. Hebrews 13, starting in verse 10. He says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin and burned outside the camp. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. For here we have no continuing city, but we seek the one to come." Basically a message here, a final benediction to his audience saying, you need to leave Judaism because Jesus is not in Judaism. He's outside Judaism. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp, outside Judaism. But frankly, if we don't understand what all these different terms mean, this passage probably means nothing to us. And maybe there's some of us in the room right now that we've never read this passage before. And we don't understand the power behind why Jesus is outside the camp. So what my aim to do this morning is just to explain to you the passage. So what we'll do first is, probably for the majority of the time, we'll talk about the camp and what he's referencing when he's talking about the camp. We'll talk about bearing his reproach there in verse 13, what that means. And then 14, we'll end with verse 14, talking about looking towards that new heavenly city. And hopefully at the end we'll read this passage again, and now we'll understand what the powerful thought is here about going to Jesus outside the camp. Well, what was the camp? The camp, what he's referring to, is something he's already talked about back in Hebrews chapter 4. But he's referring to the Exodus story. Leave your marker here in Hebrews 13, or get a piece of paper, stick it in Hebrews 13. We're coming back often. But go to the book of Exodus. Exodus is the second book in the Bible. It's right after Genesis. We're going to Exodus chapter 15. Here in Exodus, Moses has just delivered the people from Egypt, slavery in Egypt. God has sent the 10 plagues. Pharaoh has let the people go. And now, from here on out, we are traveling from Egypt to the Promised Land. So what God does is he sets up a camp. Eventually, he's going to have the tabernacle built. The tabernacle is going to be set in the center of the camp, and this is where the Levites are going to make the sacrifices for the people. This was going to be their most spiritual place. And outside the camp would have been all the tents of the different tribes of people. And the different families would live together there inside the camp. And the people are going to stay in this camp all the way until when Joshua actually leads them into the Promised Land. This is the way they're going to travel. And they were living like this in this camp for about 40 years. Well, what was inside the camp? What's in the camp here in Exodus? The camp that the Hebrews writer is referring to. Well, what's in the camp is everything you considered ever to be sacred. We've already talked about this, and this is talked more about in Exodus 33, but we're looking at chapter 15. But the tabernacle was there inside the camp. They built it while they were traveling. And in the tabernacle was the holy place where the Levites worked to perform their offerings. And within there was the Holy of Holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was. And inside the Ark of the Covenant was the Ten Commandments, the rod of Aaron, and a piece of manna that we'll talk about in just a second. And everything you did in terms of worship and praise to God had everything to do with the tabernacle. And everything to do with the Levites, as the priest class that worked there in the tabernacle. So you can picture for just a second for you, everything that you would hold sacred, everything that your mother and your grandmothers and your grandmother taught you was sacred, would have been there inside the camp. It is all you would have ever known. All that you would have considered to be holy was there inside the camp. Secondly, all your family and friends were inside the camp, weren't they? We've already talked about how God had them split up and they lived as tribes, individually surrounding the tabernacle that was in the center of camp. Can you imagine what kind of life you would have lived there for those 40 years amongst all your family and friends just in walking distance of your tent? You know, today we live in a society where we are maybe too much dependent on vehicles to get anywhere. If I want to go see Nathan one day, you know, the first thing I would do, I would like text Nathan, hey, can I come over? And Nathan may or may not reply. And if he does say, yeah, I can come over, well, then I have to get in my car and I have to drive to the other part of the city and I have to go and knock on his door, and it takes me 15, 20 minutes just to go visit Nathan. Imagine if you're living in the camp and you wanted to go visit Nathan. Well, I'd just walk out of my tent, walk down the road, go to his tent, you know, maybe yell first, you know, Nathan, you want to go get lunch or something like that, right? And you can imagine the community that was in the camp. Was this a bad thing? I think it was something probably very enjoyable. At least I feel like it would have been for me, being someone that's, I think, social. Maybe for us that aren't very social people, maybe would have not enjoyed this. But everyone you ever knew was there inside the camp. Your family there was inside the camp. And you wouldn't have to travel far to go see them. All your friends, you wouldn't have to go travel far to see them. They were right there living with you in the camp, worshiping together and working together. And another great thing about the camp is here in Exodus 15. And are you ready for this one? Free food. All the food you could eat was in the camp. In Exodus 15, it's not very long before the people realize as they're traveling that they have no water. They come to a bitter well there in verse 22, the wilderness of Shur. And there at the well, they could not drink of the water because the water was bad. It was bitter. In verse 24, the people complained against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? He cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. And when he cast it into the waters, they were made sweet. Then he made a statute and ordinance to them, and there he tested them. But there in our first moment here, we're like, wait just a second, we're thirsty. We have a well here, but we can't drink out of it. What does God do? God provides them water, right? We go to the next chapter here, chapter 16. Look at that. The people are walking, and they realize, we don't have any food to eat. Verse 3, the children of Israel said to them, 16:3, children of Israel said to them, oh, we have died in the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, where we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out here in the wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. The Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And there it continues the thought, verse 12, go all the way down there. I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quails came at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. Verse 14, and when the layer of dew lifted there on the surface of the wilderness, a small round substance as fine as frost was on the ground, and the children of Israel saw it and said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was, and Moses said to them, this is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Think about this for just a second. You're living now in a camp where you no longer have to work for food. It is literally on the ground when you wake up. And he feeds them by morning the bread of heaven, the manna. And then at night he feeds them quail, he feeds them meat. And then when they're thirsty, you just go to the next chapter. In chapter 17, they get thirsty again. And what does God do? He tells Moses to strike the rock, and water starts coming out of the rock, and they're able to drink to their fill. You don't have to work for food in the camp. I mean, nowhere in human history did people not have to work for their food. And now literally, if you're hungry, you walk outside your tent and there's sandwiches on the ground, That's what we would think. And then you just pick it up and you get what you need for the day, and that's what you eat. Of course, you collect twice on Friday, so you don't have to work on the Sabbath. This is what life in the camp was. And usually when we focus on this, we talk about the complaining nature of the people. But if you think about it from this perspective, the camp was good. It was the life of comfort in the camp, because God had richly blessed them so. Well, that was what was in the camp. What was outside the camp? And as you can imagine, it's going to be the complete opposite. Well, one thing that was outside the camp, we already got this from Hebrews 13, but there was the burning carcasses of the offerings. Leviticus 16. Go past Exodus. Go to Leviticus, which is the next book, chapter 16. Leviticus, a book giving the commandments to the Levites of how they would conduct themselves. There's a lot of laws here about civil law, not just spiritual law. Chapter 16, we'll just read verse 27. 16:27 of Leviticus, the bull for the sin offering and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought in it to make atonement in the holy place, shall be carried outside the camp, and they shall burn it in fire, their skins, their flesh, and their offering. When they would go and make a sacrifice in the tabernacle, they would make the sacrifice. But then what they were supposed to do with the carcass of the animal is take it outside the camp and burn it to dispose of it. Right? Now, just to be very clear here, and it's because often people will come up and talk to me after this and go, well, Andrew, wouldn't that have smelled good? I mean, I like the smell of barbecue, right? And for one thing, we might have a problem. We don't know the difference between barbecuing, grilling, and burning something. Barbecuing, hopefully you would know that this is when we cook our food by smoke. When you have a smokehouse or something like that, you barbecue the meat by cooking it by the smoke, and it smells good. We like that smell. When we grill, it's when we put it on a hot fire. We try to cook something very quickly, and we're cooking the meat. We're not burning the meat, and it smells good. But they're not doing either of those things here. They are burning the meat. And what does burned meat smell like? It smells awful. And one of the reasons why they're doing this outside the camp. They're not trying to do this in a place where everybody can smell it. They're trying to dispose of the carcasses. And this is what they're commanded to do. You go outside the camp, what's the first thing you smell? You smell the burnt offerings that are on fire outside the camp. The other thing you would see if we walked outside the camp, we would see lepers. Leviticus 13, go back 3 chapters. Not just the lepers, but all those that were diseased had to live outside the camp. And it was the responsibility of the Levites to take care of them. Chapter 13, verse 46. Let's start in verse 45. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn and his head bare. And he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. And he shall be unclean. All the days of the sore he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. That the lepers would have to live isolated with their disease outside the camp. People that if you were clean, if you didn't have leprosy, people you didn't even want to go near to. Fearful that you would catch the contagious disease. The outcasts, the disease, the lepers lived outside the camp. We're not have to turn there and read this one. But also it was commanded that their sewage be disposed of outside the camp. The only reason why I knew about this verse because when I was little at a summer camp, we were all writing our favorite Bible verses underneath our name and our phone number. And once somebody gave me their name and wrote this verse there by it so I would read it and know what it was. But you can even think, we see this from a gross perspective, but you also kind of see the genius of God. That he would understand he would need to give commands about what to do with their sewage. And he doesn't want the sewage inside the camp. That would be disgusting. And that would be obviously very unclean, and even in a sanitary view. And he commanded that their sewage be outside the camp. Leviticus 24, we're still here in the book of Leviticus, unless you turn to Deuteronomy to check out verse chapter 23. But look at Leviticus chapter 24. Here we see a young man that has blasphemed God. He was born in Egypt. His father was an Egyptian, but his mother was an Israelite, and he said something evil about God. He's been accused of blasphemy. And so they catch him in the act. They bring him to Moses in verse 11 of chapter 24. And in verse 12 it says, "Then they put him into custody, that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take outside the camp him who has cursed, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him." The executions, when they killed people because they broke the law, that happened outside the camp. So just looking at this from an earthly perspective, where would you rather be? Would you rather be inside the camp, or would you rather be outside the camp? From an earthly perspective, we would all say we would want to be inside the camp. Inside the camp, there is comfort. And inside the camp is everything the earth has to offer is there inside the camp. But what's one more thing, or maybe I should say one more person that we can add to this list that is outside the camp? We would finish this list with Hebrews 13:12. Jesus is outside the camp. And hopefully you left your marker there or a piece of paper there. Look at verse 12 of Hebrews 13. Hebrews 13:12. "Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate." When Jesus was put to death, he was taken outside the city of Jerusalem to be put to death. Verse 13, "Therefore let us go forth to him," where? Outside the camp. Jesus is in the place that isn't considered comfortable. Jesus is at the place maybe that we necessarily don't want to go. And yet, that's the only place that he is. And so what the writer's asking us to do is to choose necessity over comfort. Choose what you need, Jesus. Go where you need, where Jesus is, whether staying in comfort inside the camp. For these people, it was the analogy to leave Judaism. Leave Jerusalem. Leave Judea. You're going to have to leave your family and your friends and everything you know, and you're going to have to follow Christ. Why? Because you need Christ. And that necessity should overpower the will to stay. The next line here in Hebrews 13 is bearing his reproach, right? "Therefore let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach." What does that mean? Well, the reproach is basically another word for rebuke. Bearing Jesus' rebuke. Bearing Jesus' shame. And the thought is here is that when Jesus was put to death, they shamed him. They mocked him. They made fun of him. They said he doesn't belong, right? And that's why they ultimately put him to death. By us going outside the gate, outside the camp to go find Jesus, we will also share in his reproach. We will share in his shame. But what does that mean? Well, just to get real and to be very specific, if you go find Jesus outside the camp, that might mean that your family will be ashamed of you. That might mean that your family will reject you. And there's people in here that didn't leave the camp as in left Judaism, but they left their way of life, they left their family in the camp, and they chose Jesus instead. Was that a comfortable decision? No. But they did it out of necessity. If you leave your camp, the place, the things that you've always known, the place where all your friends are, maybe they too will be ashamed of you. Why? Because you're bearing the approach of Christ. You think about Jesus was taken out of the gates to be put to death. Who's the next person we see dragged out of the city gates to be executed? Stephen. Why does Stephen get dragged out of the city gates to be put to death? Because he was bearing the reproach of his Savior. Since the world hated Jesus, why would we ever be surprised that it wouldn't hate us, those that follow him, us that follow him? Hopefully you're still here in Hebrews. Look at chapter 10. If you bear Jesus' reproach, your community will make a public spectacle of it. Chapter 10 here, verse 32, talking about the first century Christians. "But recall the former days, which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings. Partly while you were both made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. We'll finish reading this later. But even here, the thought is that you chose Jesus. You were illuminated. You were converted. And what's the first thing that happened to you? You bore the tribulations. You bore the reproaches of Jesus Christ. Your community made a public spectacle of you. They turned you into a joke. They called you foolish. They made fun of you because you decided to go outside the camp, do something different, and follow Jesus and go find him there. One more kind of in this section. If you leave the camp, you will join all the other outcasts that Jesus saved. Chapter 7 of Hebrews. Here using the phrase uttermost, which is the same thought as the outer edge of the group of people. The outer edge of people. Verse 25 of chapter 7. Therefore he, Jesus, is also to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. If you go outside the camp, who are you joined with? Now you're with the lepers. Now you're with the people disposing of their sewage. Now you're with the carcasses that are on fire. These are the people that you have joined because you have chosen Jesus, because they have chosen Jesus also, right? He has gone out and he has saved the uttermost, the worst of the worst, the outcasts of society. Those are the people that he targeted, and many of those people responded and were saved. These are the people that we've joined. Looking at all these things, if you go outside the camp, do you fit in our society anymore? Do you fit in? Sadly, many of us as Christians, we're trying to live a life where we have one foot inside the camp and one foot outside the camp, and we are trying to fit in. But if you got one foot in the camp, you are still in the camp. Jesus doesn't have one foot in the camp. He's outside the camp. And until we put both feet outside the camp is when we're going to be actually with Jesus. We're never going to fit in. Think about the Jewish Christians there, that the original audience who this was written to. They were the people that didn't fit in with the group that didn't fit in. What I mean by that is they're living in a Gentile world and they're Jews. They don't assimilate into society. Everyone walks by them and clearly knows that they're Jews by the way they dress and the way that they talk and what they do on Saturday. And they're the outcasts of society, right? Now think about Christians that are Jews. These are people that are already in the group that's the outcast, and now they're the outcast of the outcast. The Jews don't accept them. The Christian Jews, they don't fit in anywhere except for with each other. Don't you see the desire for them to go back into the camp and go be Jews again? What did these people want? They just wanted to fit in. And that was going to condemn them, right? That was the temptation to go back inside the camp, is trying to find a place to fit in. Well, understanding all these things, let's give us some hope. If you bear the reproach of Christ, you won't fit in with the world. The world will be ashamed of you. But the Hebrews writer says that Jesus will not be ashamed of you. Look at Hebrews chapter 2. The two times the word ashamed is used in Hebrews is used in a positive sense. Hebrews chapter 2, starting in verse 10. For it was fitting for him, Jesus, for whom all things were, by whom all things, and bringing many sons to glory, to make captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. And holding on to this thought, who else is not ashamed of you when you don't fit in with the world? God is not ashamed of you. Look at Hebrews 11, verse 16, finishing up the story of Abraham and Sarah. It says that Abraham and Sarah in 11:16, but now they desire a better country, that is a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now, we just talked about how we're never going to fit in. And we talked about how the world's always going to see us different. Don't you know that that applied to Jewish Christians, but that also applies to us that are members here at Gardendale? Do you ever think about how little we fit in? We don't fit in with the world at all, do we? I mean, we watch the news and we're told that we're hated, right? We're told that our way of life is backwards and wrong all the time. We know we don't fit in with the world. Here's another question. Do we fit in with those in Alabama that call themselves Christians? So we're already part of a group that doesn't fit in. We're Christians, or those that call ourselves Christians. Now, we're the Christians within the general group of Christians that don't fit in with the other Christians. Are we not the outcast of the outcast? And of course, I'm not speaking about every Church of Christ on their sign. There's groups that have Church of Christ on their sign that I think aren't following Jesus at all. But I'm talking about specifically the only people I can talk about, which is the people I know right here. We don't fit in with anybody. But we do fit in with Jesus. That he is not ashamed to call you or me his brother or his sister. We don't fit in with anybody. But we do fit in with God. And when we say things like, well, my God says, or my God does, or my God gave me this here. When we say my God, God looks down, and he's not ashamed of that. He says, go ahead, Andrew, you call me your God. I accept that. That's powerful. Thinking about bearing the reproach of Christ, look a little bit later in chapter 11 to verse 26. Here's the second time, the third time. Second out of three, maybe I should say, that the word reproach is used in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with God's people, than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. That Moses made a choice, and he saw the necessity of Christ in his life. The reproach of Christ was worth more than all the treasures that his camp, Egypt, had to offer. Why? Because God is asking us to choose the necessity than choosing the comforts of this earth. Don't choose to fit in with the earth. Choose to fit in with God. And by doing so, we have to go outside the camp. Well, again, to ask the question, why? Well, why is the reproach of Christ such a necessity? And that's the next question we're going to ask. Why is going outside the camp the necessary thing that we have to do to be saved? Well, it's because Hebrews chapter 13, 14. And if you're over here in chapter 13, 14, you can read it, or you can read it up here on the screen. After saying that we have to go outside the camp to Jesus, bearing his reproach, it says this: for we have no continuing city, but we seek the one to come. The thought is the reason why we have to leave our camp and go to Jesus instead is because our current camp, even though it might be comfortable, it is temporary. And Jesus is eternal. So we have to leave my city so I can go live eternally in Jesus' city. And that's why the thought here is that it's necessary. When we look back from a worldly perspective, going outside the camp seemed idiotic, didn't it? Why would you go outside the camp? There's no comforts there. There's nothing good there in our earthly mindset. But when we look at it from this spiritual mindset, is it not now logical to go outside the camp? The place where I'm living is temporary. I have to go to somewhere eternal so I can have an eternal home with Jesus. Think about the Jewish Christians again that first received this. And maybe this book was written in 68. In 2 years, the Romans are going to come and they're going to wipe out Israel. These people literally had no continuing city. They were going to have to leave Judaism and the Jewish cities, weren't they? Literally. Because it wasn't going to exist anymore. They did this, but so did Abraham and Sarah do this. Go back to chapter 11. Abraham and Sarah again. Verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. Look down to verse 14. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have an opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a place for them. What was Abraham and Sarah's mindset? Why were they willing to leave their camp to go to a land they had never seen and bear the reproach of Christ? Because they were looking for that heavenly city, right? They were looking for the necessity of something eternal. And that's why they came out and went out of their camp. Just like Moses. Look at Hebrews 11:27. We've already read this passage, I know, but we've already read a lot of these passages. Verse 25, Moses, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is the invisible. That Moses was able to choose the sufferings of Christ, to suffer with God's people over his camp, because he looked towards the reward. And he, in his faith, saw the invisible God instead of the temporary physical king of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt that was right there in front of him. I want to add this one. Think about this for just a second. We're in Hebrews 11, and we're talking about all these different biblical figures who literally realized they had no continuing city. And she had to leave the city and join God's people. Would not Rahab fit this? I mean, for her, it was literal, right? Her way of life in Jericho, the city of Jericho itself, her life of prostitution in Jericho, that was something that was temporary. And she had to choose to have faith in God and to ultimately leave that city and instead align herself with God's people. And we read her story in verse 31. Finally here, Hebrews chapter 10, we already saw a group of people do this. And in Hebrews 10, this isn't a group from the Old Testament that had to choose to leave their camp. This is a group from the New Testament. These are Christians that had to choose to leave their camp and look towards the reward. Verse 32, we're going to read it again. But recall the former days in which you were illuminated. You endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods. And stop right there. This is all that they've done, right? They've suffered Christ's tribulations. They suffered Christ's reproaches. They had their goods plundered, but they had joy while it was happening. Why? It's the end of verse 34. Knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. What was the first century Christians doing in Hebrews 10? They were suffering the reproach of Christ, knowing that they have no continuing city, but they can seek the one to come. Right? Why do we suffer with Christ? Because we know we'll be glorified with Christ in his eternal city. Right? Well, why do we choose to go outside our camp, go outside our comfort zones, go somewhere where we've never been? We choose that because we understand the necessity to be with Christ who is outside the camp. That's why. Before we sing Faith is the Victory, can I read chapter 13 one more time to you? And now that we've kind of explained it, we understand what he's talking about, we can just read it one more time. Hebrews 13:10. We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach, for here we have no continuing city, but we seek the one to come. What a powerful way to end the book of Hebrews, right? And let me use this as a way of invitation. Go ahead and put your Bibles up. Go ahead and be thinking about the song. I think sometimes when we start the invitation, we go, okay, well, Andrew's done. So we start fumbling around, we start looking around. So I'm going to give you a chance. Go ahead and put your Bibles down. We're ready to sing the invitation song, all right? Let me give you the same benediction. Let us go forth outside the camp. Why? Because that's the only place that Jesus is. He is outside our way of life. Maybe he's outside everything that our mother and our grandmother and our grandmother's mothers taught us. And not because they were bad people, they just didn't know. They didn't know that we had to go outside the camp. Maybe choosing Jesus is choosing to leave your family and your friends and everyone that you know in your way of life doesn't believe in Jesus, isn't following Jesus. Maybe you have to leave them to choose Jesus. Let me give you my last one. Maybe free food is inside the camp. And maybe in a more application way that we would see it, maybe your very career depends on you living inside the camp. Maybe your very career, your resources come from something that where Jesus can't be. What do you need to do? You need to go outside to him, outside the camp. Why? Because you're choosing the necessity of Jesus over everything else. For we have no continuing city here, but we seek the one to come. If you want to help us and help you seek the city to come, if there's any way we could assist you, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.